So to walk you through, we'll start by introducing you all to the PFAS problem, and then we'll talk about the PFAS legislation in Massachusetts, as well as action steps you can take, and then talk about PFAS-free procurement, and again, action steps. And we thought it would be helpful to start by sharing a local PFAS contamination example from Massachusetts. And I caught one story, and it sounds like there's some similar experience in our group today. But to share what's on the screen, this is a link to a Boston Globe article from April 9th, which shared updates on the PFAS issue in Westminster, a rural 8,000 person town in central Mass. And back in 2022, Massachusetts environmental officials discovered hundreds of private wells were contaminated with PFAS, also known as forever chemicals. And the contamination source was a composting facility. And more upstream, of course, the companies that sent waste to this facility are to blame as well. They're part of the picture. And they discovered the contamination when a private well near the composting business had 50 times the state limit for drinking water for the 6 PFAS chemicals they tested. And more than 200 private drinking wells have been contaminated. And as a solution, the officials ordered that the facility and the waste sending companies connect families to the uncontaminated public water, so get them off of their wells. And 4 years later, we're in 2026 now, the companies continue to disregard deadlines, and residents are dealing with various health issues. The article talked about a child's skin rash, which is, they think, due to their intermediate filtering system that's not quite right. And then even cancer that people potentially think could be connected to this previous exposure to the contaminated water. So during this interim phase, a lot of residents are relying on stopgap measures such as bottled water that you see on the screen, or the filtration systems that sounds like they require frequent maintenance. So you can imagine your day-to-day being disrupted with all those extra steps and visits. And then there's the psychological toll of knowing the potential health costs of your previous exposure. So as of December 2025, only 15 homes had been connected to that public drinking water, which was fewer than their 60 home goal by that date. And so now state officials are threatening fines and legal actions if the company doesn't finish that water line extension by the end of 2026. And so the article has, sharing lots of perspectives. You hear the company perspectives, and they say, well, we didn't produce PFAS. Like, you can tell they're the conduits in this story. And so some of them just don't want to take responsibility. Others are saying it's complicated. We had snowstorms. And then, of course, the residents are very frustrated. And some have even filed a lawsuit for damages, such as having to monitor having that medical monitoring expense now in their life, and reduced property values was mentioned. So we'll talk soon about how PFAS contamination obviously goes beyond this town. I think others have mentioned their own experiences, and as well as how much we're paying as a state to remedy this. So I think I will turn it to Lindsay next.
Thank you. That was great. And we really do want to highlight the stories that are going on in Massachusetts. But I also want to give you a little bit of background if you don't know much about PFAS. PFAS stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, which is a big word, and also can be a big molecule. And it's really a big class, too, of thousands, if not millions, of dangerous synthetic chemicals that are used in a wide range of products and industrial applications. And we'll talk a little bit more about what those products are and how you encounter them in your life. You'll often hear that PFAS are referred to as forever chemicals because they don't break down in the environment. They have the strongest bond, basically, of any molecule, and it's thought to take the force of a bolt of lightning to break this bond. It's so incredibly strong. And so once these chemicals are released or put into products, they persist. And that persistence is really at the core of the problem, both in the environment and in our own bodies. Next slide. So why are they a problem and what are some of the health effects? From a public health perspective, PFAS are concerning because of their links to a range of serious health outcomes. So you can see in this picture that PFAS are associated with thyroid disease, increased cholesterol levels, which leads to a number of chronic illnesses, um, cancer, because they're an endocrine disruptor. So we've seen them linked to breast cancer, thyroid cancer, kidney cancer, testicular cancer. And these cancers are happening often in young people that are exposed at really high levels. Firefighters are a great example where young men have come down with testicular cancer after being exposed to PFAS, but even teenagers. There's a really famous story in another state where a teenager helped pass legislation because she was so impacted and her high school was so impacted. We're also especially concerned about their effects on infants and children, including impacts on growth and development. As I said, they're an endocrine disruptor, which means they basically disrupt the signaling system in your body. And so it can have everything from reproductive effects to causing cancer. Another important topic that's close to my heart is that inflammatory bowel disease, ulcerative colitis specifically, has also been linked to PFAS exposure. And that's important because we're linked to it in things we consume, like water, like Stefanie was just mentioning, and a few other things we'll talk about too. But this exposure is really widespread. These chemicals are in the blood of pretty much every single person in the country, every animal in the country, even, they found it in polar bears and in eagles' nests and the eggs in the nests. So it's very widespread and persistent. Um, and so it isn't an isolated issue, even though we hear about these terrible stories coming to light, but it's really something that's affecting populations at a broad scale. And next slide. So PFAS, just like they are in the environment and everything, they're also in so many products we don't even think about. They don't just come from drinking water. These chemicals are used in everyday products, many of which you can see in this slide. Things like food packaging to help contain the moisture from the food and stop the packaging from breaking down. Textiles, waterproof clothing, waterproof boots, stain-proof spray that you put on your clothing. Those are just a few examples. There's also cookware, which is another important source of exposure. Non-stick pans often have PFAS in them. And personal care products. I think that's where it really just shocks me that they're in shampoo. I'm not even sure what it's doing in shampoo, in dental floss, which is getting directly into your mouth and your contact lenses. So it's really in a ton of stuff. And so we're exposed all the time in a lot of ways. So even if we address contamination in water, exposure can continue through these other routes. That's why we think that solutions really need to address both environmental contamination as well as ongoing use in consumer products. Next slide. I'll pass it back to Stefanie.
Thanks. So I have found that reading more about PFAS and hearing community stories, I'm going to click this, has helped me feel more confident and empowered to take action. As a public health researcher, I just think the sociology is really motivating to hear about the communities affected. And I wanted to share some of these resources in case you want to learn more on your own or want to share with a friend and have more people care about this important issue. So as probably some of you already know, 3M and DuPont knew for decades that PFAS was harmful before the truth was revealed more broadly. So this is really, in essence, a true crime story and on par with tobacco companies concealing the truth and putting profit over human health. So if you want to read a full book, I highly recommend They Poisoned the World by Mariah Blake. where you'll learn the origins of PFAS production. It was something used to build the atomic bomb in the U.S. And so you'll learn about the context, and you'll also learn about various communities' efforts to shed light on the community health harms that these chemicals have and the efforts to seek resolution. So the book really focuses on Hoosick Falls, New York, which I heard mentioned in the introduction as somebody being aware of. So if you want to learn more about that story, definitely recommend this book. I did see that there's a podcast with an interview with the author, and I'm sure lots of other interviews online if you prefer to hear the author that way. And then next on the list was this fabulous essay that was actually in I think it was Best American Science Nature Writing compilation from 2025. That's how I happened upon it, but it also looks like it's publicly available, freely available online. And you might wonder how scientists really could have stayed silent over the years at these companies. And this article delves into that and shows there's a lot of nuance behind the scenes. Not black and white. The company manipulation and the gaslighting really was a big deal for the staff involved. And it unpacks how the truth is fragmented at these companies deliberately. So a scientist might just know a piece of the truth, and that's intentional. So this article really describes the story of a 28-year-old scientist years ago. That's just a young person on the scene who came in and confirmed the ubiquity of PFAS in human blood at 3M. And it walks through how she tried to raise awareness and got ridiculed left and right. Like one colleague even gave her horse blood, their horse's blood, and then scoffed when she found it in that, saying, this was my horse. Because at that time, that just felt like baloney. But of course, as Lindsay mentioned, it's everywhere. So that was even more truth that we know. Anyway, she ended up presenting to the CEO and you would think getting a listening ear, but she actually was redirected. She got taken off PFAS work, and it unpacks the psychological toll of how at the end it was easier just to suppress any doubts and accept the company line that, yes, you're finding it's everywhere, but our employees are safe, which we now know was not true, and they knew that. But anyway, fast forward, there are just so many fun strands, fun in a morbid way, strands that the journalist finds. She found that her exact boss, the scientist boss, uncovered this years ago. So he actually hired her to just systematically, prove what he had already found. And then he retired and let her take the heat. So it's just quite the story, and it shows the scientist's perspectives, and just was really good read, really good quick read if you wanted just a kind of sliver of the story of the company and of things. One other tidbit I wanted to share to kind of build on what we're presenting is the scope of it. This author showed that the equivalent of the PFAS, PFOA, produced by 3M from 1951 to 2000 was equivalent to the weight of the Titanic, give or take, which was 100 million pounds. So that's how much is in our environment right now, plus more, right? Given it's still being added to the products that, as Lindsay mentioned. So next on the list, if you're more of a movie person, is Dark Waters, which I think is probably a classic point of entry movie that tells the true story on West Virginia of how a farmer was able to convince a corporate lawyer, Rob Bilott, to investigate DuPont because his cows were dying. And Mark Ruffalo plays Rob Bilott, and you can see how intensive this lawyer's effort was to go against DuPont and how he ultimately succeeded and paved the way. There's also a documentary out there called The Devil We Know. Haven't seen it, but I think it's kind of reinforcing the same story, just documentary. And then I'm excited to share that it looks like there's another documentary coming out in the fall. And Mark Ruffalo, interestingly enough, is a producer. He's, of course, passionate about this. And this film is being promoted as picking up where Dark Waters left off. So it's showing a more current issue, and this true story unpacks the poisoning of the Cape Fear River by Cheemers, which is formerly DuPont. It's a spinoff. And 1 in 5 North Carolina residents get their water from this source. And it's called GenX, Poisoning of the Cape Fear River. And GenX is, well, layman's term, my understanding was, an alternative, but still in this family, thought to be a little bit safer, but alternatives really are as safe as you want them to be. And then to close, just kind of grab bag items that I stumbled upon today that I thought would be interesting. As you may know, this isn't limited to the US. This is a global problem. And so to give you an example of what's happening internationally, in January of this year, the European Union created new rules that required each of their countries to monitor and reduce PFAS levels in its drinking water and to be transparent with the public. So this was the first time that they created rules for more systematic monitoring in the EU. And then lastly, there's a link on the slide where you could find which companies are promising that their products are PFAS free, which have adopted those PFAS free policies. And I saw even for floss, they had, definitely a handful of companies. So worth checking out.
Thank you. That was really helpful. And though I'm working on the science, I love the narratives and the stories, and I feel like I consume it a lot. And it's also a really good way to share the stories with other people of why PFAS is a problem. Those are some of my favorite books and movies too, and I feel like a great way to reach people. So I highly recommend checking them out. So bringing it a little bit closer to home, not that some of those stories are not involving Massachusetts, but Massachusetts really has been heavily contaminated with PFAS. This map is showing communities that have detected elevated levels of PFAS. And from what we know, that really no level is safe of PFAS, but we do have a recommended level in Massachusetts for 6 different PFAS. And we have at least 176 public water systems in 99 cities and towns, and many private wells. Don't forget private wells that have exceeded that state's legal limit for the PFAS 6. And one of the comments was just saying out on the Cape, they've also found exceedingly high levels in rivers and ponds, and also in the animals that use those rivers. So fish are not recommended to eat at many inward freshwater ponds. That's what I'm trying to say. But that's a lot of it's because of PFAS contamination. So basically, wherever we look, we find it. And these dozens of water systems and these private wells that have found PFAS, it's very expensive. You have to either treat your water with a house system if you have a private well, or the community has to create a new water treatment system for their community. But the contamination is still widespread. Remediation is costly and ongoing, and it's not paid for by the companies that have created the products that are contaminating the wells. We found that Massachusetts is facing about $1.7 billion in drinking water costs across the state for cleanup. And currently those costs are falling on the individuals in the towns themselves. And PFAS exposure, because of all the health conditions I was talking about, is also costing us between 100 million and over $1 billion per year in lost healthcare costs and productivity, or increased healthcare costs and lost productivity. So it's very much a monetary issue as well, and it's evolving across the state, and it's a problem for almost everybody. Like I said, we all have it in our blood. And next slide. So there's been some meaningful progress, especially at the state level. Like I said, Massachusetts was one of the first states to set drinking water limits and set them pretty low considering the science at the time, but we could do better. We could adopt the recommended levels that were set by the EPA that have now been rolled back a little bit. So that's one thing we could do. We have neighboring states like Maine that did that. We also have Minnesota that has become another leader. That's where the teenager story I was talking about comes from. And if you really want to hear a heartbreaking story, listen to Amara's story in Minnesota and how that motivated the legislation there. And these states and others are leading with comprehensive policies where they're banning PFAS in products, in requiring manufacturers to report use. You can now call LL Bean, for example, and find out which of their products, even older products, have PFAS and which don't. And these states are also trying to ban all future products from containing PFAS. And it's at a various level in each state as to when that rolls into place. Michigan also issued PFAS-free purchasing executive orders, which is another important tool that we can use to get rid of PFAS in our products. In 2023, 2024, we did make some progress in Massachusetts where we passed legislation regulating PFAS in firefighter turnout gear, following extra pressure from some really active firefighters and communities that have seen contamination from firefighting. And next slide. So there are two primary pathways of action that you can think about when you're thinking about PFAS solution. First, there's supply side actions, what we often refer to as turning off the tap. So let's get PFAS out of the products. Let's stop the contamination. Let's do basically primary prevention, like we like to call it in public health, by getting it out of these things that we're using every day. This includes regulations that limit production, use, and release of PFAS. It also, in some cases, makes the manufacturers responsible for the products they create and to pay into PFAS funds that will support PFAS cleanup. Second, we can have demand side actions. That's things like choosing products that are not containing PFAS, which is hard to do, even being somebody that works in the middle of it. My kids like to joke that I go through like PFAS purges every once in a while. But it's in so many things, and you can do some research. You can see some safe buying lists of products that don't contain PFAS. And so really that consumer demand and also turning off the tap are two primary pathways to kind of start from the top and start from the bottom to get rid of PFAS. So as we move into the action part of today's discussion, I want to keep those two pathways in mind. There are ways to engage at the policy level, and there are also ways to make change through institutions and communities. PFAS does not belong in our products. It does not belong in our homes. It does not belong in our families, our most vulnerable populations, like our children or people with underlying health conditions, people who may be pregnant. It just doesn't belong in our environment now that we know, even though the producers have known for like 75 years how terrible it is. But now we really know how terrible it is. It shouldn't be there. So the goal tonight is to give you a few concrete entry points so you can decide where you want to plug in.
Awesome.
I'll
Thank you,
pass it over
Lindsay.
to Celeste.
Yeah, so I'm gonna speak a little bit more about what's in the bill before we talk about taking action. And I will say this bill has been changed a little bit in its redrafting, moving from different committees So I'm not a full expert on the morph of the redraft, but if anyone has concrete questions on it, we will definitely be able to follow up. But to give you a broad arc of what does the comprehensive bill do, it tries to set up a remediation trust fund to test and treat public drinking water. So an important part of the drinking water side of things. And then it actually regulates, so that turning off the tap side of our action curve. It requires manufacturers to disclose in a database if they add PFAS to products. It bans PFAS in specific categories of products like carpets, rugs, car seats, children's products, cookware, fabric sprays, food packaging, personal care products, textiles, and upholstered furniture. And it restricts the use of PFAS containing firefighting foam because, as Lindsay mentioned, we made progress on the turnout gear in the last legislative session, but it's the firefighting foam that in some ways is worse because you can imagine that gets sprayed all over and soaks into the ground. And then it allows for restricting additional consumer products over time and restricts industrial releases. All very important things. And then there's sort of agriculture, food system side of the bill because we want to, get PFAS out of our food, but we want to do it in a way where we're not harming the agriculture community. So it requires a study of PFAS impacts on Massachusetts agriculture and prevents farmers from being charged rollback or conveyance taxes if they stop farming due to their farm being contaminated with PFAS. And then it requires the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection to phase out the land application of sewage sludge without the department's site-specific approval. So it does a lot more than that too, but that's sort of a high level, some categories that the PFAS comprehensive bill tries to address the issue on. And then there is another bill called an act relative to toxic-free kids that really drives in on trying to get toxics out of kids' products, which seems just so inherently logical to me and, a lot of people that hear about it. A little bit more detail on that. Similarly, it's banning specific products made for children 12 and under from containing PFAS and requiring manufacturers and distributors to disclose if they add any of the DEP's listed chemicals to children's products or like bought or sold in Massachusetts. And it gives businesses some time to phase that out, but it does require, replacement with safer alternatives. So the DEP should have a list of known toxic chemicals, and DEP should restrict these chemicals in products specifically for children 4 to 12 if scientific evidence shows likely exposure from interacting with those products. So the next slides get into taking some action on this important solutions in the state of Massachusetts. So, do you know who your Massachusetts legislator is? You don't need to answer live in this moment, but this will help you find out if you don't know. And you can also check. I have this directly linked to the co-sponsor part of the bill pages for both of these bills to see if your legislator is co-sponsoring. But it doesn't end there because are they actively advocating for these bills? Particularly the PFAS comprehensive bill, has gotten a lot of co-sponsors the last two sessions, just a huge amount, to where it's a bit mind-blowing when it doesn't pass, which reflects some of the challenges in the Massachusetts State House overall about transparency and knowing like what are the moneyed and influences, industry lobbyist influences on our legislators, because it seems to me like there's a huge amount of support on this bill. And here we are again with a session about to end on July 31st, and it is not a certainty at all that this bill makes it across the finish line. So on the bottom corner there, some of you may have already seen this, but we have a fast action form to write to your legislators. But I want to give a pitch now for actually picking up the phone and calling your representative and senator about PFAS. broadly and specifically referencing advancing these bills. I heard again recently a legislator talk about when they get phone calls from 10 of their constituents, that is like enough of a trigger to go, oh, okay, I need to be doing more on this. People really don't call their Massachusetts reps that much. So if you take that action, you are one of a small number of constituents taking action like that. And then I wanted to ground us specifically in today. So today in the State House, the Senate was advocate or no, that's not the word. They were advocating, but they were also debating amendments to one of the big bills moving through the State House right now called the Mass Ready Act, which is a slightly different variant of an environmental bond bill. And so wanted to let you all know specifically about toxic-free kids that Senator Comerford did try to file it as an amendment to the Mass Ready Act, but it was withdrawn. Not super surprising, in that most of the policy-oriented amendments were ultimately withdrawn on that. But we heard from our Alliance for Healthy Tomorrow partners in the State House, who are also working on PFAS, that some things that did make it in, so the Senate's version of the environmental bond bill, which still now has to go to the House. So these things are very much not locked into the environmental bond bill, but Senator Brownsberger did get in an amendment called supporting upstream solutions to PFAS pollution, which is Amendment 22. I don't need to read the number there, but it provided further that not less than 55 million there, which know that numbers in bond bills, it's funny money where they can choose to bond up to a certain amount. So the numbers don't mean that we're actually going to spend this much money. Shall be expended for research and technical assistance, grants to advance safer alternatives to PFAS in products and manufacturing, and products that prevent the future release of PFAS in air, water, and soil. Good stuff. And then Senator Moore proposed, again, this is bonding, so having an authorization for the purchase of PFAS-free protective equipment for firefighters, and that passed as well. But just to caveat this all again, this bill still has to go to the House, and so things may change. Things may change in the conference committee before the version that goes to Healy's desk. So the most important thing, overall, is to pass the PFAS comprehensive bill. But if there's some like little added actions in the Mass Ready Act, that would be awesome as well. And I want to talk about, before I get you all the links to take action together, and I'll come out of sharing at that point. I want to talk about PFAS-free procurement, municipal resolutions as well. So this is an action on that sort of demand side of Lindsay laid out, like supply actions versus demand action. This is a key demand action we could take together. So municipal resolutions are, a way to express the will of the local people. They're essentially endorsements or commitments to make change, and they're awareness raising. So it's a little bit easier than passing an ordinance or bylaw, which you might have heard of as more of a permanent rule of conduct of a local government to continue until that is repealed. But resolutions have a special and temporary character, and they're much easier to get passed generally. So what are we talking about when we say municipal procurement? So things that municipalities are buying that might contain PFAS include carpets, furniture, paint, all sorts of things that we have in our municipal buildings that they could focus on trying to buy without PFAS. And so far, it's not been an action that too many municipalities have taken on in the state. So likely where you live, you would still have a chance to make this happen. So far, it's been in Brookline, Newton, and then most recently in Middleborough. And we have a webpage of resources to help you on your way. And so for folks who might not have seen what a resolution looks like before. It's usually not super long. It's a bunch of whereas clauses that kind of help frame up what the town is committing to and what the issue is. And so that's how they're kind of helping educate as well as, you know, taking an action. And this is the Newton one specifically here. Um, and so as you can see, it was just 2 slides, and you can see the whole of the Newton message, and the now therefore be it resolved, that section is kind of the core meat of the actual resolution. And so this one has that the city of Newton purchase and use products that are certified free of PFAS where such products are available in the marketplace, and encourage its suppliers to develop PFAS-free versions of products that do not have ready substitutes. And also this one had the added benefit of supporting the comprehensive bill as well. So the city council essentially, you know, supported state legislation, which is awesome. So key to starting on the municipal resolution process is figuring out how decisions are made in your municipality. And if you are a town meeting type municipality, you want to figure out what's the deadline for getting things on the agenda. So probably the deadline has passed for spring town meeting since we're in the middle of spring at this point. But there's, you know, lots of time for organizing ahead of next town meeting if that's the case for you at this point. And it gives you time to gather allies. So do any organized municipal scale environmental groups exist in your town? And would they be willing to support a PFAS-free municipal resolution? You can also reach out to municipal officials and just start to socialize the idea, because even if there isn't the political will to pass a resolution, this might be the first they're even hearing of this concept. So it can be informative in that way too. And then there are, like any organizing, excellent ways to gather support along the way, like using the media and other forms of public education. I will say there are challenges in going the resolution route and also in trying to do PFAS-free purchasing in general, because it's hard to know where PFAS is, and it requires municipal staff having capacity to do that research and be able to apply it. There are guides like the one that Stefanie linked that help with that a little bit, and Massachusetts has created guides as well, but it's not easy still. So knowledge and availability of products, and then finding price competitive PFAS-free alternatives is also tricky. Sometimes the PFAS products are definitely cheaper. And then in the towns that have passed these resolutions, there are no tracking and enforcement mechanisms kind of inbuilt into a resolution. So folks in those communities have a hard time saying whether or not the policy statement is being followed in a particularly strict manner. So just something to know that it can be tricky, but it's still awesome for municipalities to lead by example. In Massachusetts, when, you know, legislation has been hard to pass, it does help still for towns to kind of lead the way in making the change we want to see in the world. And what I'll have about to jump out of screen sharing here to get you all these links. But what's linked on here is an example letter that you can modify to write to, I think it's a town official is the way it's set up, but really whoever in your community advocating for working on a municipal resolution together.